Reproductive Physiology, Estrogen, and Progesterone. All right, so for these two steroids, this is probably one of the higher yield things that you have to understand. They love to ask questions about estrogen and progesterone in order for you to fully understand what's going on behind the process, because estrogen and progesterone are very key to female reproduction, as you probably already know. All right, so first and foremost, before we talk about estrogen, we have to talk about sex hormone binding globulins, all right? So sex hormone binding globulins are just what carries our hormones throughout the blood, right? Because these are hormones, or these are steroids, I should say. They have to be carried within the blood, within the plasma, by some type of globulin, right? They can't be transported freely. But if they are free, that means they're active. They're more active. So the sex hormone binding globulins actually bind androgens, okay? So male sex hormones greater than estrogens, the female sex hormones. And remember that regardless of if you're a male or a female, you have both of these present throughout your body, right? It's not just one and done, right? If you're a male, you're going to have both androgens and estrogens, and same with females. But this is important. If you have, a decrease in testosterone within a female, then you're going to have an increase in amplification of the effects of estrogen, okay? And that's secondary to the fact that sex hormone binding globulins bind androgens with a higher affinity to estrogens, okay? And so they're going to bind more androgens than estrogens, leading to estrogens to be more free. All right. So if you see a female that has an overall severely decreased levels of testosterone, then you're going to see probably more of an amplification of the estrogen effects. All right. Now, moving on to the actual estrogen. What does it do? The way that I think about estrogen versus progesterone is that estrogen is this crazy person. They're going to be going nuts 24/7, 365. It's going to be amplifying things. It's going to be growing things. It's going to be essentially freaking out majority of the time. Okay. It's crazy. Progesterone is going to be opposite. It's going to oppose the effects of estrogen, and it's going to be the calmer, okay? It's going to calm things down. It's going to allow for nutritional growth, okay? It's not going to allow for growth, but more for kind of quality, okay? Estrogen's more quantity. We need more stuff going on. Progesterone is chill, relax. We need more quality of the things, okay? So keep that in the back of your mind as we go through these. Estrogen, the sources. There's going to be three sources. It's the ovaries, which is going to produce estradiol, placenta, which is going to produce estriol, and adipose tissue, fat, which is going to produce estrone, all right? Now, potency is going to be estradiol is the most potent from the ovaries. Makes sense, right? Then estrone from the adipose tissue, the fat, and then estriol from the placenta. And the way that I remember that is 2-1-3, okay? It goes 2-1-3. And diol meaning 2, one meaning 1 or 1, and triol meaning 3, okay? So that's the potency from the most potent to the least potent, all right? And that's ovaries, adipose tissue, then placenta. All right, that's the first thing you have to understand. Now, the second thing you have to understand is why are these the only three places that we're going to get the source of estrogen? Well, it's due to the fact that there's aromatase present in those tissue. So if we have ovaries, adipose tissue, and placenta producing estrogens, then we know for a fact that in those three tissues, we have this thing known as aromatase. Aromatase is just an enzyme that converts our androgens into estrogens, okay? You're not able to produce estrogens in any tissue unless that tissue has aromatase, all right? And I'm going to talk about that process specifically within the ovary right now. So what happens at the ovary is that we have two specific cell types. We have the theca cells and the granulosa cells. The theca cells are more external and the granulosa cells are more internal. But at the theca cells, we have LH acting on it, right? LH acts at the theca cells. It uses the GS system, right? So increasing CAMP, and CAMP's going to activate desmolase. Desmolase, what do we say about desmolase in the endocrine system? It is the rate limiting step for creating our essentially steroids from cholesterol. So it's going to change cholesterol into our andro with all those steps in between, right? So cholesterol goes to andro via desmolase. Now, theca cells cannot produce our estrogens because there's no aromatase present. So it has to diffuse the andro that it just made into the granulosa cells. The granulosa cells are going to receive the andro from the theca cells, and then it's going to undergo transformation via aromatase into estrogen. And that needs, though, CAMP as well, an increase in CAMP as well. And what acts here to increase CAMP is FSH. All right, so FSH acts on the granulosa cells to activate aromatase, whereas LH acts on the theca cells to activate desmolase. All right, now once aromatase creates estrogen, estrogen is able to leave, and it's going to be able to do its downstream actions. All right, but keep in mind that the granulosa cells have aromatase to create estrogens, just like how adipose tissue does, as well as the placentas. Now, we need to have a negative feedback mechanism in place in order to not allow for increased estrogen to take place, because if we have too much estrogen in the system, what did I say? It's a crazy person, right? It's going to allow for increased growth everywhere, and it could potentially lead to, which we'll talk about later, an increase or potentially cancer or hyperplasia of the endometrium, all right? Because that's one of its functions. So we don't want it to go crazy. So we need to have a negative feedback mechanism in place in order to decrease the amount of estrogen, right? So if we have too much estrogen being produced, we have to have something. And that's going to be acting at the granulosa cells. So the granulosa cells are going to produce this thing known as inhibin B. Inhibin B is going to go and it's going to inhibit FSH at the anterior pituitary. All right? When we inhibit FSH production at the anterior pituitary, then we no longer have FSH acting at the granulosa cells, activating our aromatase. So that leads to an overall decrease in production of estrogen. All right, so make sure you understand that negative feedback mechanism and how inhibin B inhibits FSH and it's produced by the granulosa cells. All right, now the question is, what does estrogen do? I've been talking all this time, I haven't even gotten to why estrogen is known as this crazy person. Well, number one, it develops everything, it grows everything. It develops the internal and external genitalia of all females. And it helps for the growth and differentiation of our secondary female characteristics, like the breasts, all right, and the female fat distribution. Very important. It allows for the growth of the follicles and the endometrium. All right. So during ovulation, we can have the growth of the endometrium in order to prepare for the ovary or the egg to potentially implant if it meets a sperm on its way. Right. So in order to grow it, we need estrogen. Estrogen is going to grow the endometrium. And that's why it makes sense that if we have an overproduction of estrogen, it can lead to endometrial hyperplasia and potential cancer. All right. But estrogen's main function is to grow the endometrium. All right. It also increases myometrial excitability. So during pregnancy, all right, when birth is about to happen, it allows for the myometrium to start to contract even further. All right, oxytocin does it as well as estrogen. Estrogen's crazy, right? It's going to allow for growth of the endometrium and increase in excitability of the myometrium. All right, it allows for the growth of the follicles within the ovary. Everything's growing. All right, very important. It also leads to an increase in bone density. It moistens the vagina and it leads to an increase in HDL and LDL. And these are important estrogen functions that they don't really talk much about. But it's important because when we see in menopause a decrease in overall estrogen, we're going to see a change in these effects. So although estrogen's functions are to increase bone density, moisten the vagina, and lead to an increased HDL and a decreased LDL, which is essentially protective for the heart, and it leads to an overall decrease in the myocardial infarction rate. During menopause, when we have an overall drop in estrogen, right? Because we no longer have, we'll talk about menopause later on, but essentially our female sex organs are unable to work anymore. So we have a decrease in overall estrogen in the body. And that leads to an opposing effect. So we'll see decrease in bone density. So that's why usually elderly females, they have frail bones and increase in osteoporosis risk. They have dry vaginas and they have a decrease in HDL and an overall increase in LDL. All right. And that leads to an increased risk of myocardial infarction. Now, everything I told you, okay, the decrease in bone density, so an increase in osteoporosis risk, the dry vagina, and the decrease in HDL and increase in LDL leading to an increased risk of myocardial infarction. Those are three very important aspects and symptoms of menopause. So you have to keep that in the back of your mind. We're going to talk about it later on the pathology, but those are very high yield. You have to know those three. All right. Now, let's say a patient comes in and they're younger though. Okay. They're younger and they're presenting with the symptoms of menopause. All right. They note that their vagina is more dry. They have frail bones. They have increased risk of, they have increased levels of LDL in their blood when they do testing. And so the question might be remaining, why is this the case? It seems like they're going in menopause, but the patient's only 25 years old. Well, then we look for other symptoms. And one of the symptoms we already discussed is prolactinomas. So if we have hyperprolactinemia, so increased levels of prolactin in the blood, it's going to lead to a decrease in GnRH, right? Because we know that they are opposite. They oppose one another. But a decrease in GnRH is going to lead to an overall decrease in estrogen. So increase in prolactin leads to decrease in estrogen, and you can present with these same similar symptoms. Okay? So keep that in the back of your mind. All right? Now, that is all for estrogens. I know that's a lot, but keep everything that I told you in the front of your mind because it's very, very important. Next is progesterone. Now, you're probably asking yourself, okay, progesterone, why did he name it as the calm type? Well, progesterone is going to oppose the estrogen's effects, and it's going to favor pregnancy. All right. So what estrogen does is it's going to help us kind of get there. All right. It's going to prepare for pregnancy. Now, progesterone is going to essentially help us stay pregnant. Estrogen helps us get pregnant. Progesterone helps us stay pregnant. And that's why the name progesterone is the name, because it's pro-gestation. All right. So it favors gestation, favors pregnancy. Now, before we start with the sources, we have to understand what's going on with progesterone. It comes from the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum, okay, is essentially the remaining portion of the follicle after the egg is expelled from the ovary. All right, so the ovary is going to create all these different follicles, and then it's going to choose one. All right, and that follicular growth is due to estrogen. All right, and the increase in estrogen is going to lead to an LH surge, and we'll talk about this later on. And that's going to lead to the follicle bursting and releasing of the egg. Now, that follicle does not regress. It turns into the corpus luteum. And the reason behind that is because the corpus luteum has a main function. It produces progesterone. All right, and what does that mean? Well, we already have grown the endometrium, right? We've already grown the endometrium. We've put in all this blood. We've grown the thickness of the endometrium so that we can, start pregnancy. But now we need to give it nutrients. We need to give it more blood, more nutrients, okay? More sugars in order to sustain a pregnancy. So that's exactly what progesterone does. The corpus luteum is going to produce the progesterone so that it can act at the endometrium to kind of give it more nutrients and allow it to kind of essentially hold a pregnancy because you're forming a human being. So it takes a lot of nutrients. It takes a lot of things to form this. So you have to have progesterone in order to do that. All right, and we'll talk about the specifics that we'll see in the changes of the endometrium later on. But that's a very important aspect of what progesterone does. And it does that because of the capability of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is going to produce the progesterone. Now, let's say that the egg goes through and your menses occurs. Okay, there was no sperm there to fertilize the egg, and it leads to overall menses. Okay, you have sloughing off of the endometrial lining, and that's it. Well, then we'll have the regression of the corpus luteum. But let's say that the egg does get fertilized by the sperm and we create an embryo, and the embryo is going to implant into the endometrium. We have to still have production of progesterone. So how do we know? So how does the corpus luteum know not to regress when there has been a pregnancy? And that is due to the fact that we have beta HCG produced. All right. And so this is where everything kind of comes together. So upon fertilization, we have an embryo that's made, and the embryo is going to implant. Once the embryo implants, it forms two layers: the syncytotrophoblast, which is one of the most important layers in the cytotrophoblast. The syncytotrophoblast, which we discussed earlier, is the thing that produces the beta HCG. Now, we never asked why does the syncytotrophoblast need to produce beta HCG? Who cares? Well, the reason behind it is because the beta HCG is going to leave the endometrium and it's going to tell the corpus luteum, hey, fertilization has occurred, implantation has occurred, do not regress the corpus luteum. We still need progesterone to maintain this pregnancy, to keep this pregnancy alive. So that's why the corpus luteum does not regress in times of implantation. It's due to the fact that beta HCG keeps it alive. All right? Now, beta HCG levels drop off after the first trimester. Oh no, and that makes, once again, without beta HCG, that makes our corpus luteum regress. So what happens? Where is the progesterone, progestation? What keeps the pregnancy keep on going for the next second and third trimesters? Well, the answer lies within the placenta. By the time that we're done with the first trimester and the second and third trimester are available, we have already created the placenta. And the placenta starts to produce its own progesterone. So we no longer need the corpus luteum to produce our progesterone. All right? So beta HCG, those levels dwindle down after the first trimester. And then the corpus luteum regresses because progesterone levels are going to be produced by the placenta now. All right? Very key understanding of progesterone right there. So the source comes from the corpus luteum and the placenta. Corpus luteum is in the first trimester. The placenta is in the second and third trimester. I hope you understand what I just said because it's very, very high yield and important. All right? Now, what did we say the function of progesterone was? Well, we said it prepares the uterus for implantation of the fertilized egg. It's going to allow for increase in glandular secretions, the endometrial glandular secretions, right? It's going to allow for spiral artery development. So we're going to have more spiral arteries, okay? It's going to produce a more thick cervical mucus, which is something that they love to ask about. And the reason behind that is it's going to inhibit sperm entry into the uterus because we don't want any more sperm coming in because we have a fertilized egg, all right? Game over. The egg is fertilized. We don't need more sperm, okay? It prevents endometrial hyperplasia. So what did I say? It opposes the effects of estrogen. Estrogen is going to want to keep on growing and growing and growing the endometrium, but progesterone is like, hey, no more growing. Let's focus on quality, no more quantity, right? Okay. Another very high yield important thing is that you'll see increase in body temperature when progesterone is produced. And so that's something that they like to ask is, hey, we've seen an increase in body temperature. What has occurred? You know that at the point that we have increased progesterone, implantation has occurred because there's increase in progesterone, because there's an increase in body temperature. So females, some people find out that they're pregnant by looking at their body temperature. If it overall has increased, okay? If it's increased, then they know that it has implanted, all right? It leads to an overall decrease in estrogen receptor expression rate. It opposes that estrogen effects, all right? Now, lastly, most importantly, it maintains pregnancy. It maintains the endometrial lining during pregnancy. It's going to relax, decrease myometrial excitability compared to estrogen, right? So decreased contraction frequency compared to estrogen is going to increase contraction frequency. And progesterone is going to act completely opposite to prolactin. All right. So progesterone is going to be progestation, right, during pregnancy. Prolactin is prolactation after pregnancy. So progesterone is going to inhibit prolactin because we don't want to be lactating during pregnancy, right? But right when progesterone levels fall, when we're done with pregnancy, we want prolactin levels to rise, right? Because that's when we're going to start breastfeeding our child. All right. And so that's why progesterone inhibits prolactin. But when progesterone levels fall, prolactin levels will rise. That means that you're done with pregnancy and you're ready to move on to the next phase of lactation. All right. Very, very, very important. This whole entire process is very important. But once again, keep in the back of your mind, estrogen is crazy. Progesterone is going to oppose that craziness, and it's going to be more calm. All right. That's all for estrogen and progesterone. I know it's been a long video, but it's very high yield.